Here we go. Okay, we're back. Thank you so much, everybody, for waiting for me with my tech issues, as always. Let's start from the top. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mental Health Festival 2024. For those of you just joining us, my name is Linda Rin. I am thrilled to be one of your MCs for today. And here at Intellect, we are committed to making mental health care and well-being support accessible for all. Our goal is really to empower organizations and empower individuals to prioritize our well-being and really create a thriving workplace. We just heard from Intellect's CEO, Theodoric Chu, on the story of Intellect and on what's next. And now I am super excited to hear from our keynote speaker, Rajashree C. Mogan, who will be sharing about leveling up workplace culture. With over 15 years of experience across the banking, fintech, high-tech industries spanning across both multinational corporations and startups, Shri has specialized in human development, focusing on areas like HR business partnering, talent acquisition, learning and development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and IT. So a lot covering here. Currently, she serves as the APAC Publishing HR Business Partner for Riot Games, and Shri holds an undergraduate degree in accounting and finance. She earned her master's in tree sector collaboration from Singapore Management University, followed by a graduate diploma in organizational psychology. And on top of all of that, as if this wasn't enough already, she is now pursuing a second master's degree in business psychology. Very impressive. I'll let Shri share a bit more about herself. But before I do so, just a quick note that if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat box. Just drop them in as we go, and we'll get to them towards the end of this session. Okay, enough from me. Let's welcome our guest speaker onto the stage. Welcome, Shri.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that awesome introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hope all of you are doing well and hope all of you can hear me. As we know, technology can always be a bit wonky, especially early in the morning. So just checking. Um, I do want to give, in addition to the awesome introduction that Linda has given, I think I do want to talk a little bit about myself, which is the fact that I have not always been in HR. So I had switched careers, right? I had switched careers from IT when I first started over to HR. And that was during probably one of the turbulent times of financial crisis back in 2008. And since then, I've been in HR covering multiple locations, regions. A little bit on my personal side, so I'm Singaporean. I have my family based out of Singapore. I am a caregiver to both my parents and my lovely brother who is autistic. And the reason why I'm sharing all of this is the term on intersectionality, which I will cover in a bit. But just to share that, as humans, as we come to work in our lives, we have so many different aspects of ourselves that we bring into work as well. And I think it's important for us to always be upfront and share who we are, what we are, right? So before I sort of launch into talking a little bit more about, the topic today, I do have some questions and insights that I would like to get from all of you as the audience. So without further ado, I would like for us to get some of the questions answered. So if admin team, we could. Right. So the first question we're starting with is, what does DEI mean to you? Right. I think DEI is such a broad spectrum. It's really interesting that people might come in with different perspectives, some positive, some negative. We'd really love to hear what your thoughts are on this front, right? So please feel free to include your comments. I hope to see some of these comments as we go through our session today. So waiting to see some answers coming in. Fairness, inclusivity. Okay. I think inclusion is a big part of what we're all looking for. So no surprises that has come through. Healing. Again, inclusivity being one of the top, I think, few words that I've seen so far. Progress. I love that. Include me. Differences. I love that. Right. So I think all of these actually capture what is it that DEI means to you. No judgment. I love that. Community trust. All of these different aspects are weaved into DEI, and it gives us the platform that we need basically to bring people together. And this could be at work and in many cases out of work as well. Thank you so much. Just see some of the further responses rolling in. All right, so let's go on to the next question. Do you think DEI is linked to mental health and well-being, right? Because some people might think it's separate, some people might think it's not. So we'd love to get some of your answers as well on this one. Let's see what are the answers. I'd be surprised if people think it's not linked, but we'd love to see how people view this. Could we see the answers possibly? Okay, resounding 94% of you said yes, and that's 6% of you who said no, and I would love to understand why. Let's move on to the last question before we sort of get started on the slides. Technology, as I have mentioned, it takes time sometimes for the questions to move. Could we have the next question up on the screen? I can't. Okay, and the last question that we have is, at what stage is your organization at in terms of integrating DEI with mental health well-being from a policies and practices perspective? I think we are all from different types of industries and organizations, and it's really interesting to understand where the participants are coming from. Okay, we have can't tell, level 1, starting, basic, we are inclusive, beginner, intermediate. So we have participants who range from a wide variety. And also this is often linked to the type of organizations we're in. So without further ado, let me sort of jump into the slides that I prepared to run through with y'all some of the information and also case studies that I have, right? So if you could move on to the next slide. Again, let's start with definition. And I think this is really important because sometimes we might have a different understanding of what it means, right? So next slide. From a definition of DEI perspective, not sure if there's a lag in the slides coming up, but I'm just gonna, great, I'm gonna get started. So DEI, as many of you know, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of you might know it as DIEJ, which is, justice at the end of it, right? And it's really organizational frameworks that seek to support, promote fair treatment with participation from people from all different types of groups. And I think it's important to understand a little bit on the history on DEI as well, because as a concept, it wasn't necessarily coined or defined by one person, but it came about because of civil rights movements back in the 1960s. There were also feminists, LGBTIQ plus activists who were involved in this. And it was only perhaps towards the 1980s and 90s that business leaders and educators formally started incorporating DEI as part of their academic and corporate resources. Let's quickly move on to what do we define as mental health and well-being, right? Because I think this is interesting and there's something that I really want to call out. So mental health often refers to the state of well-being with an individual realizing their own abilities and can cope with normal stresses of life. The particular part that I do want to call out here is not just about the absence of mental illness, but includes the capacity for positive emotions, resilience, life satisfaction, and so on. And the reason why I want to bring this up is I think often when we talk about mental health and well-being, there's often this association that, oh, it has got to do with the negative aspects of things, and then people start delving into that aspect. It's also about the positive emotions. And I just want to call out that as a term, Dr. William Schweitzer, who was in the early 20th century, was particularly contributed to and coined the term for mental health, with some of the other work coming through from Clifford Pierce, who was a psychiatrist, often recognized as one of the first to sort of term and coin the context around well-being and emotional health. Let's move on to the next slide. So a lot of question is, how is DEI connected to mental health and well-being? And I do want to explore a little bit on the history or how quickly we have moved on these two aspects. And I do have a slides coming up next that talks about it. Next slide. So while the slide is coming up, I think what I really necessarily wanted to point out was that DEI as an aspect, as I mentioned earlier, very much, okay, that kind of skipped the slide, but that's fine. So yeah, that's the slide I was referring to. Thank you so much. So this is just showing the evolution of DEI and mental health, right? If you talk about mental health perspective in the 18th and 19th century, as I mentioned, there was a lot of focus from a negative perspective, thinking that it's against human nature. And then if you look at 2024, there's been a huge shift to look at proactive mental health approaches, right? It's about focusing not just on women's health, men's health. It's about climate mental health recognition and promoting even healing modalities, excuse me, which is one of the words that came up as we were thinking about what DEI means to you. Again, looking at DEI, as I mentioned earlier, it started off in the 1960s. And in 2020, I think there was sort of an explosion around this topic, which has existed for way longer time. But that was due to several events that happened around the timeline. We are talking about the COVID pandemic. We're talking about Me Too movement and Black Lives Matters. Now, sort of bringing this all back together again, I think there's a very important concept behind why this is important for all of us in organizations especially. And that is what my next slide is referring to. And while there could be a lag in the next slides coming up, I do want to just start talking about this, right? And the term that I want to talk about and introduce to you, thank you, is intersectionality. Some of you might have heard this term, some of it could be absolutely new to you. But essentially what this is a social analytical framework to understand how groups and individuals with different and differing social and political identities come together, right? So I want to talk about myself. As I mentioned earlier, I am Singaporean, an employee. I have my family based out of here, but there is the vantage point, as I call it, that I come from is I'm Indian from a religious belief. I have a certain set of religious beliefs that I follow, and I'm also the sister to an adult autistic brother, younger brother. The reason why I talk about this is because all of us come from so many different vantage points. We come into conversations, we go about our daily lives, and at work, we come with so many different perspectives. And is this particularly interesting concept of intersectionality? It's about bringing your whole self to work. I'm sure all of you have heard the term, bringing your whole self to work. And that, to me, is intersectionality. I think it's the ability to be able to be yourself and bring your whole self and experience into any organization and feel that you're being heard and you're being empowered to give a safe space to be yourself. I do know there are circumstances where particularly people might feel like, if I voice out something, am I going to be heard? If people understand my point of view, right? And that's why I wanted to re-emphasize that intersectionality as a concept is such a key thing for us to remember as employers, employees, and HR individuals like myself, when we think about formulating policies, how do we formulate communications. So this is something that really is close to my heart. And I'm sure many of you could relate to, being your whole self at work and what that means. And that could differ from person to person, right? So moving on to the next slide, I think one of the things I wanted to talk about and explore a little bit further is how is the current climate on DEI, well-being and mental health? Again, given it's such a varied sort of experience that we are having, some of you might feel that it could be, beginner stage, it could be whatever not. But I think the key thing I wanted to highlight here is mental health is part of DEI, right? I really like this quote from Glenn Close that says, mental health needs What mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, and more unashamed conversations. Again, creating a safe space to be ourselves and to have conversations to learn more about each other. So I'd like to move on to the next slide. And like I mentioned, let's talk a little bit about what is the current climate on all of these topics, right? And I decided to grab some headlines that I saw, which is Singapore specific, but outside Singapore as well, just so that we get an understanding of how do we see the direction in which we are going. Next slide, please. And while that's loading, what you would see is about 5 to 6 article headlines that I think is very interesting in terms of how we are coming across as locally, what are some of the challenges and opportunities we might have, and also globally, what is the direction that we are going towards. Sorry, just got to move along the All right, so I think given the sort of limited time that we have, I do want to talk a little bit about, the impacts on organizations. And if we could move on to the slides, I think one of the things I really wanted to talk about was how we are from different organizations, right? Different levels and stages of organizations. Some of us could be from startups, some of us could be from, really well-established organizations. And one of the key surveys that I wanted to point out on the slides is actually a survey that was conducted by Tech Target Enterprise Strategy Group, interestingly known as ESG, where they spoke about the different types of organizations and how they were able to tie a DEI metrics to impact, right? Again, unfortunately, I feel like the slides are not moving, so I'm going to talk through this, pardon me. But there are 4 levels of organizations, right? There is nascent, emerging, evolving, and leading. So what this typically means is that if you're in a startup, right, you might have very well intentions around, thank you, there might be very well intentioned around DEI and mental health and well-being, but there could be some restrictions or they could be disconnected from the broader business goals. Again, this is understandable given the fact that you're figuring out your business goals and you're trying to integrate this policy. And then of course there is emerging, which is really around recognizing they understand the business values, but they are at the early stages of aligning their efforts. Evolving and leading, I would say, is definitely moved beyond compliance and awareness. And it's more about the implementation of things, right? And of course, leading talks about some of the great companies that all of you know, where they have actually set the record in terms of policies and how can they fare better. They actually set the example for different industries that they're in as well. I do want to move on to the next slide. And this is a little bit more on my personal experience that I do want to share about. Again, I'm kind of running through all of this, and I'm sure these slides could be shared later, but these again are data on the business impact that DEI policies have had on individuals. And it also talks about, the different stages that I mentioned that the organization could be, how many of that leaders see that is important versus perhaps actually having the organization to agree with some of the statements. If you could move on to the next slide. I do want to talk a little bit about my personal experience in terms of case studies that I've gone through. Okay, again, given some of the, thank you so much. So there's 2 case studies that I wanted to talk about largely. One is a grown-up initiative that I was involved in, and this is years ago with one of my really close friends and colleagues when I was working in Visa. And the reason why I want to talk about grown-up initiative is there is the focus on leaders, but there are initiatives that can kick us off in this direction if there's something that really means a lot to us. So I was part of talent acquisition team back then, and my really close friend and colleague came up to me and say, hey, Shri, I really think we should participate in Pink Dot. And I was like, ooh, why does this mean so much to you, right? We had a discussion and we brainstormed an idea, which we never knew whether it was going to work out or not. But the idea of it was, let's present a business case to folks that we know within the people team and business leaders from a cost perspective, and let's see where this takes us through. Fast forward, it was the first time that Visa had participated in Pink Dot, and that was a small enough, or in some cases, it was a big enough achievement, but we were happy to have done that. And the reason why I'm bringing that up here again is going back to, while we expect leaders to actually set the tone in organizations, sometimes there's just so many things happening on the ground that they may not have an idea of what to do. So ground-up initiative is really important. I do want to move on to the next case study, which is my perspective as a leader when I was working with an organization called Flow, also known as Asia Connect, and I was hitting the people team back then. So we were working during the time of COVID when I was with this organization, and a lot of our employees were based out of not just Singapore, but across Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. And everyone was working from home. There was a huge turnaround issue. People were kind of like, what do I do? There was boredom. They felt there was a lack of connection. So there were a few things that we were looking at. One of it, which I really want to highlight, is medical benefits. And you can imagine how this was front and center of everything during COVID time. Again, different countries have different needs, and we had to speak to a couple of leaders and people on the ground to look into that. But after sort of a bit of a study, we decided that, for example, in Indonesia, they were more focused on inpatient treatment. And so that's what we were focusing on with the insurance companies to see how we could make some small but effective changes to that. And that is key. I think we need to be open to hearing feedback on the ground and trying to see what are the changes we can make. Again, some of these changes are incremental. It's not going to happen at one point in time, but it's important that we look at it. The other thing that I wanted to call out, as you can see, is training and needs analysis. You might be thinking, how is that connected to any of these, right? Well, at that point in time, people felt very much isolated and alone at home, and they wanted to connect with people through some kind of learning and interaction. So for the first time ever in the organization, we came up with some learning modules. In Indonesia, it was to learn English. In India, it was more focused on communications and having someone talk about how can they connect better with their manager and present. So again, this example is to talk about, as a leader, how do we went about looking at how do we better connect with the employees and give them the space that they need to feel connected. And that was part of mental health, right? People felt isolated during that point of time, and people felt that they needed more support from leaders in the organization. So this is just another case study that I wanted to share with y'all. And if anyone has any questions on either of this, I'm happy to share further on that as well. I know we have a lack of time as I'm breezing through some of these slides. So I do want to move on to my last set of slides, which is on how do we do better, right? And for that, I look at it in three perspectives. There's the leader's perspective, there is the HR people team perspective, and then there's the employee perspective. So if we go to the first slide on leaders, again, I'm going to breeze through this. I think for leaders, it's really important for us to weave what is our DEI stance with our business needs. I'm sure you're serving customers and clients who are not all the same. They have niche needs. And it's about identifying and connecting with your customer and client base and reflecting that from, is my staff reflective of what my customers and clients are like? Are they different? And so again, it's about weaving in the DEI as a concept and about mental health policies. It is also coming from a place of curiosity. And the third point is to create safe space. I think these are baselines, and it allows for you to ask questions to learn better so that you can work better on your policy. Sometimes, like I said, change is an incremental, and it doesn't happen all in one day. And as leaders, we need to create the space for people to be able to come up to us and say, this would represent us better. I want to move on to the next slide, where we talk about, as HR individuals, what we can do better. And I think a lot of you already know this, but it's about connecting data with the case studies or the presentations that we want to make. Often or not, it's coming from quantitative and qualitative perspectives, talk about data, and there's sufficient data out there in the market. But what have we done internally to reflect? These are the needs of our employees. How do we reflect that in our policies? Is there an overwhelming response that a particular policy needs to be relooked at? And I think it's also important about having sponsor and a lead from the business to support us and to champion the baton together with us. The last point here is obviously on providing toolkits. I'm talking about managers might be struggling with how do they deal with a neurodivergent employee. So it's almost about finding some of these toolkits and formulating it for what works in your organization and sharing that with managers. Last but not least, I'm just going to say that given time, I'm going to speed through this. So there is another slide on what we can do better as an employee, but I'm going to pause at this point in time and I'm going to hand it back to the host.
Thank you so much, Sri. We really, really appreciate your sharing today. I really loved your sharing. I also loved seeing what the audience kind of shared in your questions. Thank you so much for having those questions as well. Um, to close off real quick, I can also share a bit about what Intellect does, what we do here. We have that dedicated client success and client solutions and consulting teams that help HR leaders craft their well-being programs to cultivate a more inclusive and psychologically safe work environment. So if what you've heard so far about from Shri is interesting to you, if you in the audience feel like you'd like to learn a bit more, feel free to reach out to herself. Please don't also hesitate to reach out to us here at Intellect. So thank you so much, Shri. Personally, my favorite part was being your whole self at work. I really appreciated that. But I think our audience really had a lot of good takeaways. Thank you so much for your time today. And for those of you looking to rewatch Shri's session, the replay will be made available on the events platform and on our YouTube page as well. I saw a couple of people had difficulty joining. Feel free to go look at that rewatch later on. And for our next session, you can choose among 4 global webinars on really, really interesting well-being topics. So we have parallel sessions in Vietnam, in Japan, and Australia, and one general APAC session. So to join any of these, you'll have to register for them separately. You might have seen in the chat, we've had some difficulties with some people joining. The ideal way to join is to go back to your email and click the Join Now button. And if you have any problems joining any of the upcoming sessions, make sure that you use Demio's supported browsers. So that would be Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge as well. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. We'll have a quick survey as well that you can do by scanning the QR code. We'd love to hear your feedback on just kind of see how we want to shape any kind of future events. And with that, I'll hand it over to our next session. And thank you so much once again, Shri.